Lankan lawmakers have elected six-time Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe as president in a move expected to set off more protests in the crisis-hit country. After a closely contested election, Wickremesinghe has secured 134, while his main rival, Dullas Alahapperuma, secured 82 votes. For more on the developments in that country, I'm joined now by Sri Lankan journalist Vinod Kumar Moonesinghe. A very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. The president, Sri Lanka now has a new president, despite his unpopularity with the public. Talk to us about how this process unfolded.
Well, the actual protest began due to shortages which were caused primarily by the Ukraine war, but it had been building up for a few months through the COVID-19 pandemic. And the fundamental cause of the crisis was the fact that we are short of foreign exchange. We have had a negative balance of payments for the last 45 years, amounting to about 10% of GDP in each year. And on top of that, we have got an average of about $4 billion US, which are channeled out through misinvoicing by various companies, by importers and exporters. So this caused a huge dollar crisis in this country, and that led to the shortages, which led in turn to the protests.
What do we know about the new president? I mean, I know that he's got over 4 decades within the political space. What are some of the expectations and promises that he's making?
Well, he was the nephew of the president, J.R. Jayawardena, who actually opened the economy in 1977. And he was a cabinet minister in that administration. So he has had the most experience of governing, I think, of most of the politicians nowadays. The man he is supposed to be appointing as Prime Minister is Dinesh Gunawardena, who's been in Parliament since 1983, and is in fact the son of the person who introduced Marxism to Sri Lanka. So you got as bedfellows 2 politicians coming from opposite sides of the spectrum, and the expectations of these of the people in these politicians is that they will solve the crisis quickly. Whether they will be able to do so or not is still a moot question. We have asked the Russians and the Chinese to help us, and the word is that the Russians and the Chinese are going to give us some kind of help. India has been helping us. But unfortunately, although we went to the IMF, we have no help has been forthcoming from the IMF yet. So at the moment, we have to rely on our friends in the BRICS alliance rather than on the so-called world community.
How has the new president been viewed by Sri Lankans? I mean, you speak about his relations to the former president. How are citizens receiving him?
Well, there are mixed feelings. I mean, there's a section of the public which is very much against the protests which have taken place. A lot of them actually took part in the protests at the beginning, but when they became violent, they quickly turned against them. So that portion of the population actually is very supportive of Mr. Wickremesinghe, because he has a reputation for being something of a martinet. And they believe that any uprising will be crushed by him. So there's that expectation. There's also the hope from among the business community, many of whom think that he is pro-business. So they expect great things from him. As I said, there are mixed feelings about him. Although he was very unpopular at the previous election, he has considerable stature in the country despite that unpopularity. And during the uprising, the leader of the opposition, Mr. Sajith Premadasa, has lost a lot of the backing that he had. In fact, I was told that about 25 of his MPs had defected to Mr. Wickremesinghe.
You say there are mixed feelings. Pardon my interruption. You say there are mixed feelings. The other end, which may not be so supportive, is accusing him or believe that he mishandles Sri Lanka's finances. And as you and I speak, Sri Lanka is effectively bankrupt. So are there any signs of perhaps this election which may spark even further unrest and chaos as we've seen in the past few weeks?
I don't think there'll be chaos, not the kind that we have had in the past period, because the expectation, the people's expectation is that Ranil Wickremesinghe will deliver in the short term. He is felt to have better relations with the West than the other leaders, and they believe that he can deliver some Western aid, which has not been forthcoming so far. On the other hand, Mr. Dinesh Gunawardena has got good relations with India, Russia and China, all three of them. So they are also likely to be more cooperative. Whereas Mr. Sajith Premadasa and Mr. Dullas Alahapperuma, they are unknown quantities in leadership. And Sajith Premadasa is viewed widely as a failure. And Dullas Alahapperuma does not have a great following in the country either. So, and most of the governing party MPs seem to have supported Mr. Wickremesinghe.
So, what's the latest around the former president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who's fled the country last week? Are there any developments about him?
Well, what we gather is that he'll be returning at some point very soon, and he'll be taking up the presidents which is given to former presidents and the various other perks. So I don't think that he'll be in any danger, because frankly, this most of the animosity towards him was caused by heightened feelings because of the shortages. If the shortages are resolved, then you'll find that few and few people will be have animosity towards him.
Very well. Let's perhaps leave it
there.
There's
also a problem. There's a problem of most of the animosity towards him was generated by a lot of false propaganda and also a certain amount of racism. For example, he was continuously connected in the social media space with Uganda. He was supposed to have been sending all his money to Uganda, and you can see why they're linking him with an African country rather than with an Asian or a European country, because they are trying to present this whole idea of a kafir, if you'll pardon my French, with him. This happened earlier as well when the king of Swaziland came to Sri Lanka, and various opposition newspapers said he was not really a king because he's from Africa. So you've got this kind of racism also in play. And it's generated by the former ruling classes who were in the saddle when the British were here. And both Mr. Wickremesinghe's father and Dinesh Gunawardena's fathers were prominent in the anti-British struggle before we got independence, whereas others are not so prominent.
Yeah, perhaps let's go back a few steps. The current president, that has been elected now, Wickremesinghe. What sort of, you made mention of the reaction around him. You said there was mixed feelings, and there were protesters calling for him to step down. How did he respond to that?
Well, he didn't respond at all to the protests, because as far as he's concerned, he's been appointed legitimately. From the beginning, he was appointed by the then president, then he was made acting president by Parliament, and now Parliament has constitutionally elected him as the president. So there was actually, the protesters were threatening the MPs not to vote for him, and if they came back threatening them not to come back to their villages. which is totally undemocratic. And one wonders about the democratic credentials of a movement which is going to threaten MPs if they vote the way that they want to. And there was one of the leaders, the leader of the Frontline Socialist Party, Mr. Kumar Gunaratnam, had actually said that their struggle is higher than the judiciary, the legislature or the executive. So you can see that they are trying to present themselves as the actual alternative government without having any democratic credentials whatsoever. So that creates a lot of... Sri Lanka has got a democratic tradition for most of the past 80 or 90 years. So even when we were a colony, we were one of the first to get universal adult franchise. And except for a hiatus of about 17 years in the 1980s, we have had democracy.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. And let me thank you for your time. Thanks for weighing in here and giving us a bit more detail about this. Vinod Kumar Moonesinghe, Sri Lankan journalist, speaking about Ranil Wickremesinghe, who has won the presidential polls in Sri Lanka now.